All right. Anyway, I wanted to talk about this book I finished reading. It's called Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam. It's I got an older version. It came out around 2000. There was an updated version that was released, I think, this month, which might be updated with new data. But there's some interesting things I just wanted to bring your way and see what you think about them. So, the idea of the book, and I'm not going to do a whole bunch of quotes here. I'm not going to do a bunch of like readings and everything. I'm just going to kind of go through point by point, and you could jump in. It's about the fall and possibly rise of community spirit in America. And it
Yeah.
deals with it tracks Americans' general interest in civic duties and extracurricular groups and community engagement and social cohesion over time. And as you know, it's going to be a lot of stuff you've heard before. It's going to be a lot of the decay of community, the decay of society, and things like that. But it's full of data and charts. It's exhaustively researched. It's told from a sociological perspective, and what people seem to like about it is he starts with all the data about improves. Yes, civic engagement is down. Yes, these groups have fallen off. Group memberships like the PTA or like bridge clubs, shit like that, don't exist anymore. He gets more concerned with the why and what do we do to fix it, because his central argument is that society needs this general trust to exist as a society. And basically, it's like generalized social trust is required for a peaceful society. But it can also, in modern society, this is my take, get perverted in an untrustworthy society where you just assume people are good no matter what and offload their unworthiness into the abstract. But society, if you trust your neighbor, if you have a relationship with your community, if you hang out with them, if you have block parties, if you go, fraternal organizations like, the Elks or even the Freemasons, we'll talk about them later, but or veterans groups, this idea of social cohesion, that everyone knows each other and trusts each other
Yeah.
is important. And we obviously don't have that. Now, how did that happen? And what does that mean? And his main theory to describe all this is what he calls social capital. And people might have heard that before. But social capital is just this idea that the relationships and network of people you have has value, which makes sense, obviously. The more people you know, the more friends you have, the more intimate relationships you have, and the more intimate relationships you maintain not only increases your social status, but it also gives you more of a safety net. Like, it has value, like money has value, you
Yeah.
know. And there's two types of social capital. He calls one is bonding social capital. So that might be, let's talk about like an ethnic awareness group. Let's say you're Korean and you're a group that's just for Koreans, or that's for bonding with Koreans. Then there's a bridging social group, which is trying to bridge to the outside world, like the Elks or the Proud Boys would be a bridging organization. Like, they bring in all different types of people, but they're kind of united over the central cause, and maybe unites different types of people. So that's actually and that's actually why the Proud Boys were invented by Gavin McInnes at the start. In his own words, he said he wanted to bring back this idea of a fraternal organization for people on the right who pretty much neocons, conservatives, not like us, but and then they hang out, they go drink beer, they get to know each other, make friends, and build networks. And it didn't start off as kicking the shit out of Antifa in the street. I'm happy it ended up that way, but that's how it started. But and that has value, immediate value. And then we talked a bit before about the types of change, so I won't get into that. But one thing that's interesting is like the good old days. When people talk about the good old days of civic engagement, they might have an image in their head of something in the 50s or the 60s, like the suburban neighborhood, everyone's happy, and the wife and the father and the two kids and the two cars and everything. It really only kicked off in the 60s, and even it was almost like this little microcosm in time. So he makes a point of mentioning that while Americans globally have always been far more civically engaged than most of the rest of the world, more than France, Britain, Estonia, wherever, traditionally Americans were not political. and not very civic minded. You know, Americans always had that rebellious spirit. They didn't like politics, they didn't like politicians, they didn't like getting involved in that shit. However, they were very, very civic minded in their own communities. And That's an interesting thing to think. So this idea that utopia, people kind of harken back to like the good old days, that was really only a couple of decades, and it's been trending down ever since. And what's interesting, he makes a point that right now, as of that book's writing and as of now, there's actually more civic groups than there ever has been in the history of America. Right? You know, there's all these civic minded groups. However, most of them have 0 members. Right. Huh. And he makes it like most of them are just a front set up, and maybe a couple people work there. They're advocacy groups. And if you look, a lot of them are headquartered in Washington. So yeah, you almost have, it's like, oh yeah, there's all kinds of groups you could join. Not really. There's the groups, but then the memberships to these groups have gone down. There's just more of them, which is kind of interesting.
What really matters, because what we're talking about here is actual attachment and communication and cooperation between people in a community. So.
Yeah, he says there are glorified mailing lists and check collection groups, and a good example would be the AARP. I think that's for like seniors. Like there's a thing for seniors, like a group that seniors join, and that's their group. But really, they don't meet with each other. What they do is they mail a check every year, and then they get a magazine or a newsletter. And so this is where the term card carrying came from. Like, I'm a card carrying member of this, but that could also be a bad thing, because all you have is this card. There's no other work you put in. There's no other networking you've done. You're a member. And he gets into this later. I guess I'll touch on this now, because in a proper civically minded community group, you're building intimate relationships with people you know. And you would do favors for people, and you mow your neighbor's lawn. And the idea was trust was so high in the society that even if you didn't get something back immediately, you would trust that it would come back to you somehow in some way. And that person's trustworthy. They're going to hit me back, or I could ask for a favor later. Now, even in whatever groups exist, it's almost strictly transactional. A good example is like, one of the biggest things right now is professional organizations. One of the most popular ones is, medical associations or any kind of trade has their own association. However, that's just credentialism. That's just, I'm paying into this group so I can put this sticker on my resume. It's like, it's what's in it for me. And the question, what's in it for me, for a long time, and maybe throughout most of human history, didn't really exist in the same way it does now. It needs to be, what do I get right now? If not, I don't want to go there. It's work. Everything just seems like work unless I'm getting a reward immediately, which is an interesting way to think about it.
I think the phrase immediately is the key thing here. It's about time preference, right? Because it isn't that our ancestors didn't expect to get anything back. It's that they expected to get the other thing back with interest at a later date. They didn't expect to get it immediately. So now with this transactional method, you would only get into the deal if you saw the output of the deal immediately, or within the same day, or within a described time frame that you'd both signed and stamped, right? Whereas in the traditional method, because it's a high trust society, you get into it. It's fair to say that our ancestors still only got into it because they got something back out, but what they got out of it was essentially subscription in this larger society where everybody looks out for everybody else. So you're indirectly paying to live in a society that you want to live in.
Yeah, and also, again, it comes back to the trust. Like, I'll do a favor for you now, and you'll hit me back later, whatever. But now we're paranoid. Where if I don't get something back right now, you're going to forget about it. The moment you walk out that door, you're gone. You're trying to take advantage of me. You're trying to scam me. And
no longer a high-trust society.
Yeah, the problem is that's accurate. That's very accurate. Yes. And I'll get into the multi-ethnic part of this, but we complain all the time. We're dealing with Indian people, like, yeah, they literally are trying to scam you. If you don't get them to sign on the fucking line right now and get a check from them and bring them with you when you cash the check, then it's you have to, because there's negative trust there.
Yeah.
And another point, antitrust. There was he made another point that in the modern age, he always said Americans traditionally they didn't like voting. They weren't big on the polls. However, outside of the polls, outside of politics, Americans were always very active in politics. And what we see now is, especially with the election, especially with electoral trust through the fucking floor, in the basement, in the well, is that people are as more political than ever, but less specifically engaged and voting less than ever. So in a way, the politics that we're interested in are not municipal, are not community based, are not even city based, and that's a common complaint people have. But the politics we're exclusively interested in are big picture politics. Almost the things all the stuff we talk about is the stuff we have the least likelihood of changing. Now that's an interesting thought, right? Like, and that's the only stuff that gets us going and riled up. And geopolitics is more interesting than what's going on in your city right now. Like, when's the last time anyone voted for a fucking mayor? When's the last time? And I've worked on a political campaign before, and so is Camille. Like, that's the hardest thing. Like, everyone wants to vote for the prime minister. No one really cares about the MPs. And it's, if you see that from the inside and you see the low interest, it's like, wow, it's staggering. And here's another interesting angle. And again, I'm not going to give people page numbers. I'm not going to do a lot of quotes, but these are just things. It's a fairly large book. It's well researched, lots of graphs. What he is saying is true. The findings are true. It's how he interprets them that I take exception to, because this man, you can tell, and I'll get into this a bit at the end, is a diehard liberal. And so throughout the book, he's talking about, marginalized groups, how hard, we can explain this because of marginalization. We can explain this like, it's the same sort of thing you've heard before about, America should be about freedom and we owe it to Black people, stuff like that. But, once he gets in the data and tries to interpret the data, this is where he's up on the wall is all the data, and he's trying to wrestle with it because he's like, wow, I didn't think it was this bad, and and it stopped. And this is why I want to get the updated version if I can, because again, this was at 2000. This was pre-social media, so there's only a brief little section on the net. It's like, well, we'll see where this what this thing does to us. And I'm like, oh, it didn't go anywhere good, and that's kind of my take here, which is if you take this idea of the fracturing, and here's the thought. Okay, so what he had found, and I don't know if I mentioned this before, but what he had found was one of the fastest growing sorts of civic-minded community groups that young people are interested are political advocacy groups. So here you would see like the Democratic Socialists of America. Here you might see the Proud Boys. You might see, so whereas we had municipal, civic, community-based stuff. Now, the only time young people meet in person is in a political advocacy environment, which is interesting. So that's where they meet, they shake hands, they make friends, and maybe they make connections. However, but consider this, the only way we know how to make long-lasting personal relationships is within the context of trying to attack the system. Now, psychologically, that's an interesting thing to consider, I think.
Yeah.
And as and in the other sense, it's all these traditional groups have been replaced by what? Social media, but also, for the politically active, chat rooms, forums, things like that. But consider how people have to do this. You must fracture your personality, and Zoomers get this, millennials get this. Like, no one uses their same email or their same personality across everything. Boomers do that. Sometimes Gen X people do that. Your typical net citizen will have a different kind of personality on whatever platform they're on DLive, on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. So instead of engaging in one group, you're engaging with 7 different groups, but you are 7 different people. You have multiple identities. And this is where you spend most of your time. And this is the anti-community. This is the complete inverse of a community. This is the schizophrenic version of a community. And, I'm as much a victim of this as anyone. That's all I fucking do. To the point where it's difficult for people like us to even imagine another way of doing anything. But therein lies the problem. And that's why I kind of like the Proud Boys. Like in essence, when it started, this idea of, even on our side, it's like never meet anyone in real life, never go to real life events, you'll get doxxed. It's constant paranoia, constant tension. The only way you know how to do anything is to behave schizophrenically.
Yeah.
And that's just an interesting thing I thought of. And with that, with this sort of internet focused living, there is information paralysis by analysis, that maybe the divisions are caused by us actually researching more. Because consider the boomers are actually the first generation where this trend started going down. That the height of the civic America that people think of, it happened after people came back from World War II. And there was this different type of energy, this different type of strength. And he kind of makes a point to the side that he didn't really go into, but someone had said they were trying to find the moral version of war. Taking almost a warlike approach to civic engagement, more aggressive, more disciplined, more regimented. And then the boomers came after them, and that's where you actually started to see it fall off over time, and then it's been falling and falling and falling ever since. But it makes one think that to have this sort of wide-reaching civic engagement, everyone's on the same page, high trust, we're on the same team, do you need some catastrophe? And I do recall there was a different sort of energy after 9/11 in America, where it seemed that the tone changed, and then there was a bit more patriotism, there was a bit more nationalism, a bit more fervor, and that some people might say that's why George Bush kept getting elected. But after World War II, like, everyone's on the same page. Nationalism, pride, patriotism, and the further is that required to have the energy to get back to this community focus and build this trust. And also, here's another point. Is civic engagement more likely the less information you have? And I'm not trying to call them stupid, but when we talk about paralysis by analysis, if there's fewer things to argue about and fewer ideological divisions to have, people will just get along more, won't they?
Yeah.
After they're not.
There's
back then.
There's people will get along more. There's also the idea that the literal paralysis through analysis. If you have fewer decisions to make, you make them faster, and you spend more time in the field and less time planning. Right?
Yeah, and also, I consider this, that back then and right up until I'd say even the 90s, there was no real alternative media, not like we see right now. There was no Breitbart. There was none of these various channels and real subversive media. And what passed as subversive counterculture media was MTV. It was corporate. You might have had zine culture. You might have had punk rock music. But how long did it take for punk rock to become corporatized, to become mainstream? Like, there was maybe 2 punk bands ever that actually pulled it off. And so it's like, what was the alternative media? They just trusted the media. They trusted the paper. There weren't a lot of fringe newspapers. And if they were truly fringe. Like, you had to join a mailing list to get a guy to mail it to you. And now the alternative independent media is actually a media structure where you can have websites and channels and videos. But again, there was less information, not because they were dumb. It's just that concept didn't exist.
Right.
And so, and that's why we have this paralysis, because we talked about this before. All we talk about right now, not just us, the entire society, is media analysis.
Yeah.
Even the news networks spend all their time talking about other news networks.
I think there's another effect as well, like some kind of a placebo or like a parasocial effect, where you get your political or civic fill off of arguing with teenagers on the internet rather than going and talking to your neighbor, or you get your fill by listening to Tucker Carlson and then you shouting back at the television, yeah, Tucker, yeah, you tell him, and then you feel, in a parasocial way, you feel involved. But if you didn't have that, you'd probably be much more likely to go and rally with your neighbors.
I also think, in that same vein, this never occurred to me, but it's more of just an amusing observation. They've really corporatized the concept of revolution. And you used to be able to say like, oh yeah, the Nike does that, but they do that for the left. It's like, well, that's kind of what, Tucker Carlson. I like him. I don't. Some people are turning it on recently, but what they're selling, what QAnon is selling, what a lot of them are selling is this like multimedia revolution, which has that anesthetizing placebo effect in a way. Like, can revolution be mainstream, or is that how you defeat it? That's an interesting idea. This is just me pitching ideas for people to think about when we talk about does it require tragedy? Does alternative media? It's stuff like that. But just to wrap this up, it's kind of funny. So his whole goal here is like, how can we find our way back? How can we fix this problem? Because he does admit it's a problem. And this guy, he's a professor at Harvard. I think he's the third most referenced guy in the entire sociology field. Like, he's a known guy, Robert Putnam. But the solution in the book basically is a very liberal take, which is, people need to be forced together more often to build bridging social capital, like we talked about. So it's like, people don't get along. We have to change how cities are built. We need to make laws. We need to incentivize people doing this, which is like, okay, yeah, throw money at it and rework everything and hope it works. But here's and Flash, everything needs to be rebuilt to fix everything. And Flash, and we need to get back to the Boy Scouts. Back to the, the Boy Scouts. No one goes to the Boy Scouts anymore. Flash forward to now, this year, Boy Scouts is bankrupt, and they are in litigation for, I believe, something to the tune of 92,000 sexual harassment and molestation claims.
Jesus.
Over the decade. 92,000 as of this. Well, the reason is that you should not let homosexuals around young boys. But that's, we'll get into that later, because that's a situation where literally the only people were there were men and boys. Like, you can't say, oh, maybe some of them were after girls. None of this was strictly gay men molesting children. 92,000 of them. Yeah. But also, just to end, I wanted to check up on some of his more recent developments, and on his Wikipedia, I came across this. So, in recent years, Putnam has been engaged in a comprehensive study of the relationship between trust within communities and their ethnic diversity. His conclusion, based on over 40 cases and 30,000 people within the United States, is that in the short term, other things being equal, more diversity in a community is associated with less trust, both among and within ethnic groups.
You don't say.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. And wow. This ran counter to the contact hypothesis, which many sociologists believed in, which proposes that distrust declines as members of different ethnic groups interact. So, they're running up against this, and he did all this research, and he came up against it, and then he got in a bit of trouble because he had said, I did the study, and I was trying to, before I published, I was trying to figure out how to frame it and what to do about it, and they were saying, that's not your job. If you did the study, tell us what the study is. And here, just to wrap it back to the liberal thing, and I'll end on this little quote for this part at least. Putnam denied allegations he was arguing against diversity in society and contended that his paper had been twisted to make a case against race-based admissions to universities. He asserted that his, quote, extensive research and experience confirmed the substantial benefits of diversity, including racial and ethnic diversity, to our society. So this is kind of what I wanted to summarize about the liberal mind. And when I say liberal, I don't mean leftist. I don't mean Marxist. I mean truly the liberal, the center left. The liberal, they live in a constant state of ideological flux. And their favorite term is but still. Yeah. So here it's like, here's all this data. We did all these fucking studies. In the short term, the long term, cohesion breaks down. There's more conflict. And he says, yeah, but still, diversity is good.
Yeah.
And you see this in the news. You see this in magazines, articles all the time, where someone will make a claim about something, and then the but still for them is experts say. Experts say, is there another smarter version of but still, where they're like, here's what they say, but experts say that's wrong, and then they won't go any further than that, and they'll just end it with that. almost as if it goes without saying to them. In their mind, it's like, yeah, this counters literally everything I've been saying, but still, like it's true.